Well, good morning. My name is Nicholas Gertler. I'm co-founder of Galen, Atlantica, and this is the EU Leaders Forum on Health Technology Assessment for ATMPs. And as we see the agenda overall, this is also the only forum focused on reimbursement of ATMPs. So possible we may stray a little bit beyond joint clinical assessment of ATMPs, although that is the big development. We have a fantastic panel of people who are not just very knowledgeable about these issues, but actually driving these issues in Europe. So delighted to have that. I will briefly introduce them and then briefly introduce the topic. And then what we are going to do is cover the current state of HTA for ATMPs writ large, and then talk about the joint clinical assessment and the joint EU-level HTA and how that builds upon the existing foundation and what the hopes, concerns, and aspirations are for that over the coming years. So, fantastic panel, and I'll go in alphabetical order. On the big screen, François Houÿez. He is the Treatment and Information and Access Director and Health Policy Advisor for EURORDIS, which is the Rare Diseases Europe. He has been advocating for patients since 1989, first in the HIV/AIDS field and in rare diseases. And he is Director of Treatment Information and Access and also Health Policy Advisor at EURORDIS, where he supervises policy activities and the involvement of patients in the evaluation of medicines at the EMA and in HTAs. Hello, François, welcome.
Hello, good morning.
To my immediate left is Carole Longson, who is one of the founding members of NICE, the National Institutes for Care and Clinical Excellence in the UK, where she was executive director for almost 20 years. Immediately when she left, we started to bug her to come and consult with us, and I'm delighted that she is here now. She's also the vice chair of the Medicines Discovery Catapult. Welcome, Carole.
Thank you. Good to be here.
In the center, Marchetti, who has a distinguished career in medicine, HTA, and health system leadership, and he is currently co-chair of the Member State Coordination Group on Health Technology Assessment, which has the responsibility for putting up the joint clinical assessment under the European HTA Directive. He's director of the HTA unit of the National Agency for Regional Care Services in Italy. And between 2017 and 2022, he's been director of the National Center for Health Technology Assessment at the Italian National Institute of Health. And finally, on the end, Francis Pang, who is the Senior Vice President of Global Market Access and Geographical Expansion at Orchard Therapeutics. He's been the architect behind the pricing and reimbursement strategy for Libmeldy, which is the treatment for metachromatic leukodystrophy. And he has an extensive background in health economics and having served in market access roles at Shire, Biogen, and Amicus Therapeutics, as well as various committees directly interfacing with health technology assessment authorities. So what I think is particularly exciting about this group is that we not only have industry represented, we have decision makers at the pan-European level, and we have the ultimate customer for all of this represented, which is the patients. And kind of to set the stage for all of this from the perspective of getting these exciting treatments to patients, Europe has not, this ecosystem has not delivered as well as one might hope. 7 of 25 licensed ATMPs in Europe have been withdrawn. There's some not very positive reimbursement news today. So this system, for whatever reason, isn't delivering as well as it could be for patients. And part of this ecosystem, of course, is health technology assessment. That's done traditionally at the national level, while regulatory authorization is at the pan-European level, and the change that the HTA regulation from 2021 introduces is that part of the HTA assessment now migrates to the pan-European level. So that's what we want to talk about, but the broader question of the role of HTA and the path of medicines to patients, I think, bears a minute or two of discussion, because we're assuming not everybody in this room is an HTA expert. Maybe, but perhaps not everyone. So Carole, you are known both for insight and being very succinct. So let me ask you, what is the unique role of HTA in the European healthcare systems, and how does it differ from the role of the regulators?
So, difficult question to be succinct about, but I'll give it my best shots. And I'm talking generally about health technology assessment at the moment, not specifically about ATMPs, advanced therapies, gene therapies. If you think about a regulatory process, which is looking at, does something work? Does a new technology, new medicine work? And is that effect balanced against its potential harms positive? That's the risk-benefit equation of a regulator. There's more to think about of a new medicine as it goes into the clinic, and there's certainly more to think about in terms of opportunity cost, which is healthcare systems have a finite set of resources. They need to spread those resources as effectively and efficiently as possible. How do they do that? That's where health technology assessment as a discipline, as a methodology, as a process, and as an informer of decision making steps in. And what it's trying to do is not just look at how something works and is it safe. That's already been done by the regulators. It's looking at how do I use this most effectively in real clinical practice? What is the incremental effect of this new technology, this new drug, compared to what else I could do for that patient population, and in some jurisdictions, what else I could do with that money that I'm thinking about spending on this new drug. So if I try to crystallize, it's about incremental benefit, not absolute benefit. So that means it's a relative assessment, which means that the comparator that you're thinking about with the new technology versus current practice really matters. It's about opportunity cost, which is I've got to make a decision about the healthcare system overall. How am I going to make those wisely and in an informed way? How am I going to try to balance my resources across all of the patient populations that need healthcare? And most importantly, how am I going to try to find the sweet spot for the use of this new technology compared to what's already being done? I'll stop there. There's lots and lots of things that we can unpick, and hopefully we're going to be able to do that in the context specifically of advanced therapies.
Great, thank you. Francis, let me ask you, as the person often responsible from the developer side of having successful negotiations with health technology assessment authorities, is HTA for ATMPs challenging? And if so, what makes it challenging?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So, I think one thing that we can agree on is that value-based healthcare is a good thing, right? However, I think health technology assessment is challenging for a number of reasons, right? First of all, it does take time, from the conclusion of the regulatory process, to go through the reimbursement processes, which takes 6 to 9 months or longer, right? And that causes further delays for patient access. I know a number of healthcare systems do have sort of early access mechanisms, but it's not common. I think the different evidence requirements and processes for the different HTA systems need to be taken into account, and that creates some issues in terms of evidence generation. It's certainly not a costless exercise, and it does take a significant amount of resource actually to build dossiers. But I think the most important thing really is that value assessment is a subjective thing, right? Even though there may be the same evidence package for different HTA agencies, these HTA agencies may infer different conclusions on the data. And this does create uncertainty around access, so you may have differential views on perhaps the subgroups that have the most capacity to benefit, right, and can be reimbursed. May I sort of add, in terms of an analogy, it's very similar to kind of video-assisted refereeing in football, right? In that you do actually have, rules in football, But even with the video technology, the interpretation is really, really important, right? And that's where the inconsistency in the interpretation, across countries, can be a bit of an issue based on the same data package. And sometimes the data package is relatively compact. It could be for a rare disease product quite compact. But then you can have very differing conclusions on interpreting that particular data package in terms of like durability, for example, of the treatment effect. So I think that's a particular issue, the subjective nature of value assessment. I think that's what I wanted to say about HTA being challenging for developers.
That's a great opening, Salvo, because I think you lay out some of the very significant issues that we will address over the next 49 minutes. And one of those is fragmentation of decision-making across different countries. And I think Marco momentarily will ask you about how the joint clinical assessment looks to solve that problem. Different evidence requirements, both, I suppose, between regulators and HTAs and between HTAs. And then there's this question of durability. Could you touch on that a bit more before we move on? What's challenging about durability?
I think that we have to think about the European context in a different way, in the sense that there has been a slowly process to go into a more uniform and harmonized process. Actually, we used to think about that the regulation in Europe, it's a different process with respect to the approval in different member states. The value is really context related, but we have to distinguish that we have different elements into the context of value. We have some elements that have objective element. Carole mentioned the incremental benefit, the added therapeutic value, let me say. Then we have some other elements that are related to the willingness to pay, that are related to some context-specific characteristic of the member state, that anyway we are talking about of Europe, so it means that we have not so many differences in terms of population characteristic, let me say. What we can have of difference is with respect to more the organizational and economic aspect. So joint clinical assessment have the intention to align, firstly, the regulatory process with the definition of the objective element of the value that are more focused on clinical and safety dimension. And this is the main objective of the joint clinical assessment. So the intention is to arrive, starting from 2025, in which, the first application of the joint clinical assessment will be on ATMP, to have a more harmonized process in Europe. Firstly, in making more coordinating the regulatory process at the EMA level with the HTA production of information for those elements that can be objective, as I mentioned before. It doesn't make sense that I have a drug that in France is classified as innovative drug and in Italy is not. These are what I consider the objective element of the assessment. So we are for sure at the beginning of a process, but it's a process that have really behind a strong commitment by the Commission and by the member state. And also the timeline is quite strictly because the first implementing act of the regulation is foreseen for the end of this year or beginning of the next year and will be related to the joint clinical assessment of medicine.
So thank you for that. And I think it's clear that some of the objectives of this, this initiative are to resolve exactly the kinds of challenges that Francis mentioned. Before we delve into exactly how that might play out, I want to ask François, from a patient perspective and being involved with HTA processes, what is something a patient organization and the patient would want out of an HTA process, particularly as it takes on greater significance at an EU level?
Hello, can you hear me clearly? Okay, so the big question for patients is how to assess the real value of these advanced therapies, not just for patients, but for society, and how do we reconcile the different approaches? That there should not be a difference between how patients assess the value for themselves and society assesses the value. Of course, the willingness to pay and the coverage makes the decisions different. What we really need to insist on is the involvement of patients at a very stage of the development and discuss openly with the patients. How do you see the value proposal of that advanced therapy for your disease and for what cost? And we've seen successful engagement of patients who had this dialogue, comparing the existing treatments, comparing their cost, comparing the possibility that an advanced therapy would balance and treat the unmet needs that remain despite the existing treatments, but not at the cost proposed by the company, which patients would understand the affordability and the healthcare systems would not be willing to pay for this incremental benefit. And if you don't have an agreement with patients at this stage, you will have difficulties at the end of the process. We have community advisory boards of patients who meet regularly with developers, and they have a list of questions specific to the development of advanced therapies. And if these questions are not properly addressed during research and development, there will be higher uncertainties at the time of regulatory and then HTA development. So the first element is really to insist, to involve, to engage with patients and clinicians at the early stage of development. The importance, the role of the HTA cooperation, particularly on advanced therapies, is dual. First, higher transparency in the HTA process. We need to better understand on which grounds, on which scientific grounds, the decisions to reimburse or not to reimburse are made, and we expect a lot from the HTA cooperation to improve the transparency. And the second aspect is to bring the expertise at the EU level. We've observed in many situations, and not only at the EMA, when European experts from member states work jointly at the European level, they work better. Their expertise, their scientific work is often of higher quality because, to summarize, it's the feel of the responsibility that their assessment and their opinions will impact almost 500 million citizens. And in this respect, and particularly for rare disease, we hope to see progress here in the way different experts from different HTA bodies will assess these technologies, having the curiosity to change their scientific methods. There is a lot of research in regulatory science. We would like to see a lot of research in HTA science, in adopting new methods when they exist, when they are developed by different research projects, because how to demonstrate the incremental benefit. There are the traditional methods, randomized clinical trials compared to standard of care, which in reality is not always feasible, even less for many advanced therapies, and even when you have high numbers of patients. And here, only new scientific methods can apply to understand the value of these advanced therapies and whether the results of clinical development based on these new methods can be accepted by HTA bodies. So that's what we are expecting from this HTA cooperation, really to renovate, to modernize the scientific methods that are used and for which are more adapted to advanced therapies than the more traditional methods. Over to you.
François, thank you very much. And I think you point to a very important aspect of the work that's being done by the coordination group that you are co-chairing, which is to develop the methodologies. And maybe, Carole, you can give us a primer on this, and we can go on to Carlo in terms of how they're doing this. HTA is HTA, so what is the methodology that needs to be developed? And it seems like there's oncology-specific methodology, and there's ATMP-specific methodology being developed. Those are the two classes of therapeutics that will be going through JCA, and then presumably other classes of therapeutics as well later on.
Just a couple of points before we get onto the methods, because as Marco's explained, there is a really important development going on in Europe, which is to go from individual assessments of clinical added value in individual member states to a joint assessment of clinical added value across member states that is then going to be used back in the member states to make the individual payment decisions. So that's a really big move, which means now that the objective evaluation of that clinical added value has a very, very high significance. So we come back to my explanation about the difference between regulation and HTA. If we think of this as a pathway, what we will have at the point at which the HTA is being undertaken right now is a regulatory evidence package. That regulatory evidence package doesn't usually serve well for the added value assessment. So we're all going to need to think very carefully, deeply, and probably quite quickly about what needs to happen to ensure that the joint clinical assessment is given the best evidence it possibly can. And so that's where François is talking about new methodologies. But even with new methodologies, we have to acknowledge that the demonstration of clinical added benefit, the real added value of a new technology, may not be demonstrated through that regulatory package. And as a consequence, we're all going to have to think about what type of evidence then is needed for the clinical assessment, because the last thing we want to happen is that joint clinical assessment has no alternative but to say the added benefit is unproven, because what that will do is create a huge amount of debate and uncertainty back into the member states again. So I think we all need to be creative. It's not just necessarily the HTA methodologies and the HTA environment. We have to acknowledge, just like with most technologies, cancer technologies, other types of technologies, that regulatory evidence development package needs to be looked at very carefully, and I would say very critically, for what isn't there to help with an added value assessment. And I think if we start to get into that discussion, what can we do? And it may be that we can't do anything at that point.
Well, Carole, let me just stop and clarify one thing. Your point that the regulatory evidence package, or the evidence package on the basis of which a treatment gains regulatory approval, is not complete usually or often.
Is not sufficient, is
for
probably
an HTA
how I
assessment.
would.
And
yeah.
Francis, I'd love to get your thoughts on that. But that is true at whatever level HTA is performed.
Yes, absolutely. It is. It's just the added significance of now having a single signal at a European level. It becomes really important to pay attention to that.
So I think what we're witnessing is that this development of the joint clinical assessment is on the foundation of moving parts. Part of the moving parts is that the evidence package needs to evolve, or it may need to be different between regulatory approval and reimbursement consideration at national level. I think part of what we're getting from François is that the methods by which this evidence is assessed may need to evolve in light of ATMPs. And then there's different HTAs who have slightly different approaches to doing all this. And out of that, your simple job is to create one coherent whole.
I mean, I cannot, enter into the detail of the methods because this is an ongoing process. What I can say is that we have to think different, in the sense that, if I understood well, up to now, respect to the past story, regulatory process, it was an independent process respect to the HTA process that is coming later. Actually, the idea is to align also the regulatory process with the HTA process, because before I mentioned the first implementing act, the first implementing act of the regulation is foresee also the timing in which, after the EMA application, the HTA joint clinical assessment will start. It means that the same evidence packages will be used also for joint clinical assessment. Now the point is the actual regulatory data evidence package sufficient? No. So in many times, no. And this is the reason, because there is a process of alignment of the evidence packages. So we are working with EMA and the coordination group in order to align also the evidence packages. So a couple of weeks ago, we have had a joint meeting with EMA in order to go into some more specific detail or what is the limitation of the actually evidence packages, in particular for NTP, because this was the topic of the discussion. So this means that if I have to think to the future, I have to think in some different way. And the different way is that the intention is to align the evidence packages in order to be used both for regulatory process and both for HTA assessment, because otherwise it's not will be feasible to start with joint clinical assessment if I need to add some more element to the evidence packages of the regulatory process.
So there is definitely the focus going forward to align these packages.
Yeah.
Francis, from the perspective of a developer, what's your reaction to the notion that the evidence needs to be different, and how might that be
Sure.
met?
Yeah, I mean, I think with ATMPs, right, you know, in many situations you have single-arm studies, right, that need to be compared against historical controls. And, you know, it's fair to say that, you know, the preference of a number of HTA organizations is for the randomized controlled trials, right, which can be unethical or unfeasible, actually, to conduct, right? So I think that's one area of the expectations that are not met, right? I think the other area is the diversity of comparators, right? So a particular comparator may be present in a particular healthcare system, and you know, I think you would need to compare your treatments against that comparator through perhaps an indirect comparison or statistical method. And then I think there's a bit of lack of guidance actually in the JCA sort of consultation currently on that, right? So I think that's something that needs to be addressed. I think, you know, the knockout issue really is the durability of treatment effect. And we know that you know, clinical studies are of finite duration, maybe 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, right? But the healthcare system wants to be able to understand the extrapolation of that treatment effect through the lifetime horizon, right? And that's where there is uncertainty and the area of you know, judgment and interpretation that's going to be required. So I think that's going to be, you know, be a challenge, and I think different healthcare systems have come to, you know, various kind of conclusions. So, like Germany, 15 years of, you know, treatment effects. nice for in some of the recent assessments, 30 years, but some other healthcare systems less than 10, actually. And I think there has to be an understanding of perhaps the biological plausibility. So not all gene therapies are the same. Ex vivo and in vivo, and you've got gene editing that's coming soon. And I think there has to be some kind of understanding of the biological plausibility, to tie that against the treatment effect sort of assumption. And as there's always going to be uncertainty. You could have conditional assumptions that are updated over time as evidence emerges, right, as well. So just a sort of a couple of areas where, whereby, I think there are sort of challenges still in the evaluation of sort of ATMPs.
So going back to the beginning of your comments, some of the challenges involved fragmentation.
Yeah.
So joint clinical assessment can help address fragmentation.
Yeah.
Also makes the stakes higher because...
I mean, if I can just, a quick comment, what is better for manufacturer? To have 27 different member state evaluation, or to have just, one joint clinical assessment? So it's quite simple. Then we can discuss respect what is the better methods to use, what is under comparison, what is the terms in terms of follow-up for clinical advantages. But there is the place in which to discuss of this, because the regulation foresees the stakeholder network, and this is one of the, it's quite important, the evidence that the regulation give to the place of discussion. So I think that probably I try to make simple what is really complicated, but try just to think about in a future in which you have to face with 3 different PICOs instead of 27, because joint clinical assessment, according to the first test that we perform, probably we can have 3 different PICOs, 3 different comparators all over the Europe with respect to 27. So I think that is quite better for manufacturing to face with 3 instead of 27.
François, from the perspective of the patient engagement that you lead, what does this joint clinical assessment mean to you relative to having up to 27 processes that you would need to engage?
If I may first comment on the previous discussion, in case the regulatory package is not sufficient for HTA, our views is that this should not be systematically blocking for the HTA and the ultimate decision. Exactly like for regulators, when the package is not sufficient for a full authorization, it can be okay for a conditional authorization, and when we collect more evidence and then we reassess. The same should apply to HTA, where we hope the DOPT will benefit to patients more often than currently is the case. And we have methods to verify the promise. Of course, there is the question on the duration, but we have also the good examples of gene therapies which have been placed on the market for quite several years now, and if you include the time for the development, it's 10 years follow-up for some of them where the effect is maintained. So the duration of some advanced therapies could in fact be longer than what you initially thought, and not simply shorter. So the question can be both directions. But with these new methods, real-world data analysis with new causal inference analytic approaches, we can obtain evidence, high-quality evidence from other methods than to conduct randomized clinical trials. And we absolutely need to explore and to understand. One of our concerns is that HTA assessors are present and they receive a lot of training on how to prepare for the HTA cooperations, the procedures, the template, but maybe not enough training on the new promising methods. and not enough discussions earlier with the developer on which evidence will need to be generated after the authorization, after the launch, and how. This absolutely is key to make sure that we can deal with a certain level of uncertainty. And regarding patient engagement, there are three key moments where we will discuss with the coordination group on how to play a role here. In joint scientific consultations first, where patients have a lot to say on these questions that need to be answered, and for the assessment during the scoping phase, which are the important questions the HTA report needs to respond to, but also during the assessment itself, using rich methods, structured way of collecting patient data to enrich the discussion, not just consulting with 1 or 2 patients, or not just by using a remote questionnaire, but truly to use new methods that are now qualified, validated, such as patient preferences, elicitation studies, and other methods, to get the views of a larger sample of patients on how they compare themselves, a new treatment and advanced therapies compared to existing treatments or to placebo, depending on which products you use in these patient preferences elicitation studies, so that we can really contribute not only with expert opinions that we have, but with data from a larger group of patients that can complete and help interpret sometimes the results of the clinical research.
Thank you. You know, the theme that rings throughout much of this discussion is uncertainty based on available information at the time of regulatory approval, particularly as to durability, which could and hopefully is a very long time. Carole, from a HTA methods perspective, how might this ecosystem deal with that uncertainty?
So we're sort of unpeeling the layers of the onion, aren't we? And we're getting deeper and deeper into the core. But at that core, we still have the really major fundamental difference in perspective between regulatory and HTA, which is absolute benefit versus relative benefit. So let's just take an example where everyone might have agreed that undertaking an RCT can't be done. That doesn't take away the question that the HTA will still ask, which is, what is the relative incremental impact of this technology, this new medicine? The question doesn't go away. The evidence that you're bringing, if you're not doing an RCT, which you may not be able to do, is just, I will say, less powerful or less robust. So you've got the same question, and you've got evidence that doesn't help you as much from an HTA perspective. So this is where we get into François' really important observation about how, if we're thinking about methodology of HTA, how do we actually approach that type of issue? And at NICE I used to have a range of methodological options open to me: statistical analysis, inference, that sort of issue, which we applied. It didn't take away the fundamental question that we were asking, which is the same as every other HTA body, and it generated more uncertainty about the long-term benefit of the technology because we didn't have a really good signal of that quantum of therapeutic benefit at the time of regulatory approval. And so it starts to lead you into a really important, for me, observation about the joint clinical assessment process, which is absolutely fabulous, by the way, really remarkable that it's reached this stage, is that there's going to be a single signal at a European level, but that signal is going to be taken back into individual member states, and they're going to be holding the uncertainty. They're still going to be left with having to deal with that uncertainty at an individual level.
And could you just clarify
just
one
thing?
one
point.
Yep.
Whereas probably the thinking needs to be, how can I resolve that uncertainty collectively? So I would be wanting to throw that back up to the European level and saying, you know, you've really good job so far. You've done this first phase, but we're still left with having to address that, and we all know it's a problem that needs to be discussed. So that's what I would leave, perhaps, for to think about.
We'll work on it. But then the follow-up question to your point is, I guess, twofold. One is, how much of that uncertainty can be resolved by running the best possible trials, whatever, you know, within the scientific and medical limitations that are in place for ATMPs?
My experience,
I'd love to get, Francis, your perspective on.
Just give you, my experience has been that even with a really good RCT, if you've got a lifelong therapy, you've got a very long tail of uncertainty because you can't cover everything in the short time of the RCT. You can't give a decent enough signal. So if you amplify that with an advanced therapy, which may be a value proposition of a cure over a lifetime, you still have an uncertainty gap that you're going to need to fill, even with the best regulatory package.
So the problem
that sounds negative, but you know, we don't think about negatives. We think about how do you then build systems that allow that innovation to be used in the real world while collecting data, to be able to track that promise and that expectation over time.
So the conclusion is not that the developers are doing something wrong. There's probably things they can do better, things they can do worse, but at
not
this
necessarily.
Instant, yeah. Francis, as a developer, what's your thought on all this?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think there are some simple things that could be sort of implemented. So, for example, you know, when you have a regulatory package for European Medicines Agency, you have a particular data cutoff, right, which could be perhaps, you know, a year before the actual submission of the package itself, right? But between that time and perhaps regulatory approval and potential, and during the reimbursement process, there could be further data collection. I think there has to be opportunities for being able to submit that additional data over and above that data cutoff for the regulatory package, and I think that's been probably missing in some of the HTA processes so far, in that I think we are agreed that the HTA should be based on the best available evidence, but if you don't actually have all the evidence, you know, to be considered, you know, obviously you're not making a decision based on the best available evidence, right? I mean, so I think just a simple procedural aspect, you know, is important. I think the other thing is in terms of actually having the opportunity to kind of clarify, you know, some of the findings from a JCA report, and perhaps opportunity to appeal. And we've seen some, you know, health technology assessment processes actually incorporate that particular aspect, as well as incorporate feedback or input from multiple stakeholders, such as patient organizations. So I think, for example, it is, you know, impossible to have a perfect data package or evidence package, right? There will always be evidence gaps. Those gaps can be filled qualitatively, right, through input from various stakeholders, right? And we've seen some of that actually in some of the national HTA processes. So I think there are some areas where, you know, best practice could be incorporated into the future JCA, such as the, you know, being able to submit additional data, you know, at post regulatory approval, as well as the opportunity to clarify, appeal, and you know, and so forth. Yeah, so some simple procedural things.
So some important procedural ideas.
Yeah.
Marco, you have the responsibility for leading the process that will make JCA a reality, and among other areas, ATMPs. What process are you following, given the complexity of all this? We realize you can't necessarily comment on the specific methodology, but how are you going about this task?
I mean, firstly, I'm not alone. So in the sense that I have a very, 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 many colleagues, and and as I mentioned before, there is a very strong commitment by different member states to start with this process. For sure, I think that we are all agreed that the best available evidence. So, simply talking is what is the but the best available evidence. So we have just to define it and trying to adjust, the data, the regulatory data packages with this available evidence. Then for sure, there is many uncertainty that has been to manage with the joint clinical assessment. The positive aspect that I would like to underline is the fact to have a general agreement of what can be defined the best available evidence. So actually, from the manufacturer point of view, I think that the main concern is respect to the variability of the definition of what is the best available evidence. So what happens when I go from EMA to a pricing reimbursement process in different member states? So the joint clinical assessment is not mandatory for member state, but as François said before, it's really increased the transparency of the process, because as a member state you can also decide not to follow the result of the joint clinical assessment, or to start with a national assessment, but you have to justify. So you have to explain the reason, because you have not followed a procedure, a guidance, a methods that you were agreed at the European level. So it means that, for sure, I think that we need some time in order to reach, the best results for the application for the regulation. So the time is quite strict, because for ATMP, January 2025 is behind of the corner. It's behind of the corner, and there's many concerns that need to face. One of these is this could be probably another main concern of the manufacturer: how to combine the scientific consultation with the joint clinical assessment. So, and this is something that is to be managed in the next 4-5 years. But for sure, I understand completely the complexity of the process. What I can say from a positive point of view is that the regulation is entering into force in January 2002. Actually, it's 1 year and 4 months, and different member states is already started in rethinking the internal process. So in order to align their national process to what is expected to be the joint clinical assessment process. And that is something that I consider positive in order to have an harmonization. So this is what I intend when I talk about the commitment of the member state.
Great. Let's do this in the time we have available. If there are any comments or questions from the audience, then the magic cube will appear for you. So please make yourself known. And then I want to start wrapping up with the question of what advice you all will have for developers. But let's see if there's any burning questions from the audience. Tricia in the middle.
Thank you. Could you perhaps say a few words about the engagement of the stakeholder network? I know that I think the list of organizations being part of that will be published soon, but can you share any ideas on how the third-party stakeholders will be involved in the work on the development of the guidelines and the work of the group itself?
As I told at the beginning, I cannot enter into the detail because we are building now, the process. What I can say is that, there is more than 70 organizations that apply for the stakeholder forum. Actually, the process is to check for the eligibility of this organization according to the criteria of the regulation. And I know that the Commission have asked to many of these organizations further information because many information are missing in the application. What I can see is that the process is starting in the next June. So, I mean, the first meeting, if I remember well, is for the next 14th of June. So it's quite fast, the process. What I can say further to this is that internally the discussion in the coordination group is that but also what is foreseen by the regulation, the stakeholder forum is a quite important place of discussion with respect to the process and to the methods. And so, the regulation gives to this stakeholder network an important role and responsibility in the construction of the process.
Carole?
Again, just tapping back into my experience at NICE and maybe offering some thoughts. NICE has a methodology guide that it updated every 3 or 4 years, and when we started, it was a very internalized process. It was very much the NICE people and the appraisal committee, so the decision makers, developing those guidelines that then went out for consultation. So there was definitely engagement with stakeholders, but over time, that engagement turns into much more active involvement in the development of and the thinking about the methodology, such that the most recent one, which I'm pleased to say I didn't have to be involved in organising, had numerous groups that were multi-stakeholder representation, looking at different aspects of methodology and receiving academic papers and giving their commentary back to NICE on sort of their thoughts. And whilst that isn't the decision about what to do with the methodology, it changes the dynamics and the relationship from engagement to really quite active involvement. But that takes time, and I think it also takes a huge amount of resources. So we probably also need to have a look at how much genuine resource the joint clinical assessment process has received, because is it sufficient to really meet the expectations of what is going to be a very large, and I would expect a very vocal, stakeholder group.
Another question or comment?
Hi, thank you for the discussion. Seth Ettenberg from Blue Rock Therapeutics. I've been surprised that in last year on this stage we had some of the oncology teams talking about pay for performance and sort of the frustration of not getting to pay for. From your perspectives, can you help us understand? It seems to me that would have addressed many of the issues around durability or best data available that we've been discussing, but yet there hasn't really been uptake there. I wonder if you could speak or comment to that at all.
Is that one for me to start, perhaps, or Marco? I don't know if you've got any experience from Italy. I'll give you some experience.
I mean, for sure, there is a connection with respect to the best available evidence and the manager entry scheme, the payment by performance. So, if you set, define outcomes and durability of these outcomes in the joint clinical assessment, for sure, what I expect is to move this outcome into the member state responsibility for payment and payment by performance, so risk-sharing agreement or managed entry scheme, as you can call, for sure, can be used, but a more standardized approach at the European level. So that's it. So if you have a more stable and if you have an agreement on what you consider the evidence, the best available evidence, and this means also the outcomes that you expect from this treatment, then you can manage the payment according to these outcomes.
In principle, this idea of pay for performance or outcomes-based payment schemes seem extremely attractive, and they certainly have been used across member states. They definitely are used in the UK. And if you would like to think of something like the Cancer Drugs Fund, there's actually a whole fund worth of pay for performance. What you're looking to do is to try to collect data that validates the promise of a new cancer technology at the time of launch, but you're collecting data in order to verify that the outcome that was found in an RCT actually happens in the real world. So in a way, that's a pay for performance concept, but it's slightly different from what you think. It's two things I would say. It is sometimes very difficult to agree what the outcome measure is, and it has to be something that can be used in routine clinical practice, that both the clinical community and the patient community feel comfortable with. Sometimes that's really difficult. The other thing that's really difficult is linking that performance to the actual level of payment, which I've found has been the most difficult part to agree. And of course, if you can't agree that, you can't have a pay for performance scheme. And the final thing is, it's all right having one or two or three of these, but when you get a huge amount, the administrative burden on a healthcare system that probably currently isn't geared up for that type of thing is quite difficult. Again, it starts to make you think about policy development, that if you really want to have these types of arrangements in place, which you would think would be really attractive to companies and really good for the healthcare system, we have to start investing serious amount of resources into that type of system.
Okay, that is super. We need to start wrapping up. So I have a final question for each of you, and if you have the box and you don't get to answer a question, I apologize. Talk to us over there. It is now February 2025, the Joint Clinical Assessment for ATMPs has started. What is your vision for a good system? And what needs to happen between now and then for that good system to come into place? And who wants to start? So what is your vision for this well-functioning system? What's the most important thing that has to happen in the next couple of years for that to happen? François, you've been quiet for a few minutes now, so please, maybe you can start.
Maybe I'll start by highlighting the importance we see in the voluntary part of the HTA cooperation. Nothing prevents member states who would like to go one step further together, and there are already groups like Benelux R or FINOSA, to start with a GCA, the assessment report, and all the uncertainty it contains, to decide what needs to be put in place to lower the uncertainty. And we understand the complexity of this pay for performance agreements, etc. But there's economies of scales that can be done together when member states join together to propose such market entry agreements to the developer, to facilitate not only their organization but the collection of data in a standardized manner. So we would really like to see this happening and developing more, and to industry maybe to invite them to share more often and to apply more often modeling at an earlier stage of development, because we need to have these discussions, and these discussions can also include early dialogue with payers, different hypotheses, depending on different efficacy levels, depending on different durations. The earlier you can have this discussion, the easier it is for the decision making when you have the actual results. And including for health economic models, there are different methods to appreciate if a price for an ATMP is fair or not, but they diverge largely. So part of the voluntary cooperation could also be to start assessing which health economic modeling approaches are best fit to appreciate this concept of fair price for ATMPs.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Grant us an extra 2 minutes, if you would, in jury time. Francis, it's February 2025, things are going well. What do you see as the value of this initiative, and what does it take to get there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think fundamentally JCA needs to have an impact on the speed and breadth of patient access, right, compared to the status quo of individual country assessments. I mean, I think that has to be the main objective. I mean, I think, you know, decisions have to be sort of fair, reliable, and timely in terms of the outputs of the JCA, and I spoke about some of the, you know, modifications that are required to the methodologies, but also the processes. You know, I think the JCAs have to be practical and manageable, right? I mean, there is a survey of the PCOs that happens initially at the outset of the process. You know, I think it has to be manageable, right? And you know, you want to see products launched in Europe, right? You don't want to see JCA being such a, you know, a difficult, you know, concept to manage that, you know, companies don't launch in Europe anymore. And so I think innovation, you know, coming to Europe, you know, is it would be also you know, characteristic of a successful JCA. And I think, you know,
how do we get there? Briefly.
How do we get there? I mean, I think obviously the stakeholder consultations, you know, are really, really important, and ARM has been inputting into those, and I think there has to be, you know, good, you know, technical discussion, you know, and meaningful consideration actually of some of the feedback that's taking place. Obviously, JCA 2025 January is not going to be perfect. It'll be subject to continuous process improvement. We've seen that with other health technology assessment processes. You know, so, you know, if I can mention NICE, I mean, it's like at least 10, 15 years before it started, the processes started to embed, you know, and so I think here, you know, there is certainly hope, right, for the JCA, but certainly, you know, hopefully we'll get there.
Great. Marco.
2 points. The first one is the alignment with the regulatory process. So the alignment of HTA process with the regulatory process, it means that we have to work as coordination group with EMA in order to align also timing and process and evidence packages. And the second one in the next years is to align the procedure and methods actually used in Europe for MTP in order to have just one approach, all European base.
Great. Carole, you have the last word, or a small number of words.
Small number of words. A joint clinical assessment report that is both useful and usable at the member state level, and a report that is held in high regard by stakeholders because they've been listened to and they can see the impact of their interactions on the processes that have been developed.
How do we get there?
You've got to talk to the stakeholders.
Talk to the stakeholders. Thank you all very much.
You're welcome.